Welcome everyone, this is Hidden Frame with a gameplay and narrative analysis of the Legend of Zelda series. For those who haven't played these games, especially the 3D ones, I recommend doing it so prior to watching this video, since I won't avoid spoilers throughout the discussion. From the first arcade game to every modern open world titles, there's one single thing that's never changed, and never will. Playing video games is an act of following a set of rules. A learning simulator that demands a constant response to how different mechanics interact with each other. Rules are immanent to the simplest concept of hitting B to attack and A to jump, the complexities in narrative development, world building, player progression, and so on. Ultimately, the player can relate to those rules as something to either master or learn with. Some games may present their basic mechanics and just develop gameplay by demanding more precision in execution. That is, even if there is a contextual change, be it in scenario, story, etc., the act of play revolves around developing some hyper-efficiency in hitting B to attack and A to jump at the right moment. There's rarely an attempt to apply some twist in the player's understanding of the game's mechanics, keeping this simplistic homogeneity a central point of the experience. On a larger scale, every diegetic element is reduced to a focus on player growth, explored in a gameplay concept of successfully pushing a button when asked to. Even with a contextual variety that may depict learning, like some boss fights that demand a studying of its attack patterns, there's no substantial mechanical variety if you're always dodging projectiles and trying to inflict the highest rate of damage per time. The premise is that learning is quick, the rest is just training to achieve perfection. Yet some games can achieve a bombastic, cinematic spectacle with a well-structured narrative and a well-implemented variation of context, so immutable mechanics become a more interesting narrative tool. Those tend to resonate in the player more for its over-the-top nature than its capacity to instigate something more egocentric over moment-to-moment achievements. Which brings us to a problematic scenario. The open-world genre is largely characterized by non-stopping player growth, yet the freedom that comes attached to it works as a detriment to the development of game mechanics. You can't ask the player to perform Y if there was no learning of X, and since there is no way to predict the player behavior, game mechanics turn into something dull. As a result, gameplay monotony needs to be compensated by an appeal to keep exploring the world, which is generally translated into a never-ending journey of raising character stats, completing arsenals, skill trees, etc. Everything happens as follows. You start a quest, do this, and this, then this. You collect a reward and proceed to the next repetition of the same process. It's not that different from what I described earlier, since it's essentially repetition of immutable mechanics that result in a gradual perfecting of the player's abilities. But aside from the fact that, different from other games, there's almost no room to spectacle in gameplay, open-world games can drag the experience for so many hours with their endless content, they end up losing any singularity, and everything becomes just senseless pattern repetition, with no substance at all. All this to say that while some of these games can be fun, or even have interesting stories and characters, they do make a case on how standardized and vicious the whole feeling of accomplishment became, meaning there's too much of a focus on the final reward. The unpolished, aggressively generic is still considered great because of replayability, content variety, and so on, and that's a problem.
Impressive, I know. Very few can achieve a mastery of the sky.
So, where does Zelda comes in? Well, some games oppose this notion of an immutable design and structure themselves with a variety of mechanics that dynamically redefine each other through an articulated web of iterations, which is a method of architecting the game's rules that gives emphasis to world building on a mechanical level, since it demands an overall understanding of a whole that gradually becomes more intricate. It's less an exercise of applying a few stationary mechanics in a variety of cases, and more of shaping the player's input based on how the world constantly subverts established gameplay notions. With the recent release of Breath of the Wild, I came to think how even navigation in most open world games is as dull as their action-oriented gameplay, generally consisting of following straight paths that lead the player to a final objective. It pretty much takes the notion of a vast world and transforms it in a vast variety of things in a world, which comes as no surprise given how the focus on player growth prioritizes quantity over quality. World building becomes obsolete in this regard, since it's ultimately pointless. Navigation in Breath of the Wild is so versatile that everything seems to coexist harmonically in the game's world, as opposed to being seen as separate objectives. Considering how every area can be accessed by experimenting with climbing, paragliding and walking, there is a clear relation between mechanical versatility and world building on a physical level, as opposed to ignoring large chunks of land by restraining access only through linear paths, with underdeveloped mechanics. Like most Zelda games, Breath of the Wild has a commitment to build narrative through the form it explores the relation between player and space. That's a premise that was firstly introduced with Zelda 1 back in 1986. The game made an attempt for the player to feel the world of Hyrule as something wonderful in and of itself, detached from a merely pragmatic play. There is no map, so the player has to draw the overall layout of the world with reference points like environment changes. Every main dungeon in the game can be accessed anytime, regardless of player progression, which makes them feel like natural parts of the world, simple, autonomous and wondrous elements of Hyrule, rather than just objectives to overcome. And even inside them, there's an effort to always redirect the player to the thrill of discovery by putting the old man as a sort of digression, hinting the solutions of Hyrule's mysteries. It's pretty ambitious considering that most games back in the day were much more precise in defining how every element interacted with each other, while Zelda would raise questions like, why the fuck those knight statues are here? It had an agenda with providing more intimacy between the player and the world the game constructed, and it ultimately brought new meaning to the act of play other than just seeking accomplishment. Now, I definitely didn't grow with the game, so I can only imagine the impact it had back in the time, but playing it today, these elements are definitely there. Briefly. Walking through separate screens with an overload of enemy encounters, while traversing blocks of trees or some repetitive patterns of rocks, and having as the most thrilling discovery after some hours the same repetitive mini graveyard or group of knight statues that fucking murder you, gets pretty old. Sure, I wouldn't ask that much to be done at the time, but it's pretty evident that the game didn't age very well. It becomes a repetitive process of mathematically calculating where in the map that square-shaped forest is and having to deal with hordes of the same enemies, while pretty much nothing new happens. You can feel how delightful it is to be thrown at unknown territory and gradually comprehend how the world and its mysteries are structured within the first hours, but then everything becomes senseless mechanical labor, and it feels like you're just, well, pressing B to attack and A to jump all the time. This struck me with a question though. With every attempt of exploring a genuine sense of wonder and having every design choice organized with that in mind, when Zelda 1 failed to deliver this type of contemplative experience, did I ever ignore the fact I was always doing the same thing, all over again? Cause going back to one of the main points, some games are structured around repetitive mechanics that don't feel like meaningless labor, be it because of great presentation and narrative, which is something I deeply appreciate, or just an overabundance of dual content, which is something I hate. These types of mechanics avoid the recognition that the player is pretty much doing the same thing over and over again. I could never shake off the feeling that everything I had to do in Zelda 1 after a certain point was meaningless, just an execution of certain rules. You can play Journey and never have to acknowledge how a set of rules controls your experience, while also never feeling the accomplishments certain games provide. Instead, it creates an integral contemplative and almost meditative experience, where beauty lies in the seemingly uselessness of everything. In some cases though, you can have an experience where the player creates this level of non-pragmatic intimacy with the game's world, while simultaneously being aware of how rule-based the experience is. That's a dual-purpose design, which is something Zelda 1 lacked, since it threw away the initial contemplative activity and fell into just sequences of objective rule execution, with no wonder at all. The biggest problem arose with overworld navigation. While creating an imaginary map is an incredible way to build intimacy, when it falls in too much pattern repetition, it becomes uninteresting to explore, and by the time there's nothing else to see, the absence of a map is translated into a series of turn left, proceed straight 2 squares, go up, etc. 3D doesn't solve that so much as it's generally stated, because the game can still restrain navigation to a set of established paths. Even if it's easier to get from point A to B because of depth perception, it's still a sequence of going from point A to B. And that's where Breath of the Wild versatility comes as such a breath of fresh air. With so many ways to reach a certain place, it becomes almost impossible to reduce navigation to an equation of diagrammed movement. Yet this type of expressiveness in movement isn't new to Breath of the Wild, although it is new to open world games, but rather something borrowed from Zelda's older brother, Mario. The first Super Mario game introduced what I described earlier as a design of dynamic mechanic iteration, where every element presented in the game didn't have its use restrained to the specific moment of its introduction, but diluted throughout the experience with new forms of iterations with other mechanics. Mario 3D World's director, Koichi Hayashida, stated he built the levels in the game based on a formula of 4 steps. The level first introduces a mechanic, further explores the player's mastering of it by presenting dangerous and more cautious situations, applies a twist to the mechanic that generally revolves around having to deal with it together with another previously introduced mechanic, and ends with a conclusion where the main mechanic has its use reinterpreted in relation to the flagpole. The first Mario game kind of fits in this formula, although it messes it a bit. Level 1 introduces a Goomba that walks on the floor, as well as a file of blocks. I'll count this as 2 mechanics. Then, it introduces a set of pipes with no endless pits below them, except one of the gaps has 2 Goombas on the floor. This is the first introduction to platforming in a safe environment, so it can be followed by a small endless pit on the ground. There are 3 elements here: Goomba, floating blocks, and platforms. The Goombas were introduced in a safe environment, so the player could learn how they work, as well as the blocks, which changes Mario's momentum when hit, and the platforms. 2 of those were, then, further developed: the platforms with the previously mentioned endless pit, and by presenting 2 Goombas in a tighter environment, it also develops the difficulty with enemy interaction. Followed by that, the level introduces 2 falling Goombas that walk on the floating blocks, 2 more endless pits, and finally, 2 Goombas walking directly below a file of floating blocks. The falling Goombas can have 2 purposes. If the player is slow, then he will have to deal with his enemies without the help of the blocks, and by having 2 Goombas that fall from above, jumping on one of them still makes the player unsafe from the other enemy. On the other hand, being agile, the player will use the blocks to deal with one of the Goombas. So the first case sharpens the difficulty even more, while the second one presents a twist, since it articulates 2 different mechanics, one of which was already presented to the player in the beginning of the level. The endless pits sharpen the difficulty of platforming, and the 2 final Goombas below the blocks acts as a twist, where the shift in momentum may put the player in a risk if the jumping is not well calculated. So if the player didn't execute the possible past interaction with the blocks and the falling Goombas, he still won't leave the stage without a twist. All is fine, but there was still no twist on the platforming. Well, that happens in later levels. Level 2 has this part where a set of blocks are positioned right before an endless pit, killing Mario if the jumping is not calculated. And level 3 has falling Goombas and walking Koopas surrounded by endless pits, which articulates enemy interaction and difficult platforming. There's a lot more that I just won't cover because this is a Zelda video, not a Mario one, but future levels will keep introducing new mechanics that constantly have to be mastered and relearned when put together with other mechanics. Even the enemies begin to be platforms themselves, which is very clever. Some games may present a never-ending tsunami of new ideas that never really interact with one another in interesting ways, which acts more as just context variation, rather than an intricate mechanical development. Mario has a care in making these types of articulation, so it can be felt as a world of its own, even if it still demands a mastering of the plumber's movement. But more than just being an expression of the player's abilities, the physics of Mario's movement is beautifully harmonized with the environment, and that's because of how a handful of mechanics revolve around messing with the momentum. It makes the player constantly influenced by how external elements interfere with basic commands, and together with the 4-step design, it creates an experience that's far richer than just seeking a sense of accomplishment. Breath of the Wild is not a platform game, but given how every piece of rock can be used to further vary Link's mobility, there is a constant visual spectacle, where the world seen through the sky, land, building expectation while climbing or walking up a hill, and so on. And just like how Mario's movement transforms mechanical variety in an uniform interaction between character and space, Link's movement maintains a feeling of constant visual wonder and overall spatial context, where even distant areas feel substantially connected because of how easy it is to paraglide from one place to another. And just like Mario's mechanics are well articulated to create this variation in momentum, Breath of the Wild's overworld is structured mostly with empty horizontal spaces and high peaks. Both preserve a visual sense of unity and connection between the world's elements, and the high peaks allows for the easiness of travel between two areas through paragliding. That's why every main city of the game doesn't feel just like an objective at the end of a straight line. They may be reached after a chain of wonder, curiosity, discovery and surprise, where the path between points A and B becomes chaotic and captivating, so the cities become wonders themselves. And the overworld has a fantastic landscape variation, with foggy forests, autumn-like trees, hot spring water, snowy mountains, etc. And with an almost seamless transition between different environments, it assures a feeling of a wildly diverse world that exists harmonically. Suffice to say that everything surrounding Link's movement mechanics and the overworld design creates a beautiful contemplative experience. But while this level of versatility is definitely new to the series, this intimacy with the game's world expressed through navigation was already a defining characteristic of some past Zelda games. Ocarina of Time broke with the action-oriented navigation that its predecessor established and made a more minimalistic overworld, where every place relevant to the narrative is highlighted in space with little to no distraction, as the player simply tilts the joystick up and watches what's around him. Wind Waker further reinforces the sense of a peaceful navigation with the Great Sea, where the ocean's nothingness overlaps mechanical complexity, and every island piques the player's attention as its silhouette reveals more details the closer Link gets to it, emphasizing a sense of constant curiosity and mystery. Yet, Skyward Sword is probably the most interesting when it comes to building intimacy. Foreign Woods is amazingly well interconnected, and the compact nature of its design pushes the player's attention to environment elements that become reference points, bringing the pieces together into a whole, like the tree in the center of the map, or this rock human-made structures. Elden explores its verticality around a gimmick, where the player has to run up a sandy ground while avoiding enemies and managing stamina, and a single major spatial interconnection occurs after a twist in this gimmick, when Link has to slide down to the base of the volcano. It unites two things pretty nicely, since it develops a mechanic to, then, apply a twist in it and shift the notion of progression that's been portrayed by how far Link ascends Elden Volcano. That's one thing, but this area also makes the best use of the game's art direction with its vertical design. The higher Link goes, the blurrier past areas become. Not only it reinforces a sense of height, but it depicts the world in a picturesque style. And in this case, with its resemblances to Impressionism, it's like a picture where the brushstrokes avoided realism to get closer to an interpretative drawing of an object, not just a perfect reproduction of it. In my view, imperfection relates to humanity in a significant manner, which further emphasizes how influent the game's world is on the player. Finally, Lanayru has some interesting moments of interconnection between areas, but it's most noticeable how it uses almost no verticality to create a sense of emptiness, and the time travel mechanic offers a glance at a more vivid past, which gives more historical context to this aspect of nothingness. And that's especially effective given how the time shift stones change time just in a limited area, so the two periods coexist in the same space every time the mechanic is activated. Also, the variation in the overworld music punctuates this transition, giving more substance to the contrast. So of course, the main difference between these methods comes to direction. Breath of the Wild demands a more versatile moveset to fit in the open world genre the game is structured on, as well as in the way it builds intimacy with an amplified scope of vision, given the overworld's design. All is well, but there is still ground to cover. Like, why did I bother to analyze the 4-step level design in Mario and write about dual-purpose design in the title if I only mentioned it once? Well, Mario's action-oriented gameplay doesn't do much to make the player aware of how the game is structured around a set of mandatory rules, but it succeeds in creating a unique type of wonder that's only possible to do with video games. There's a focus on mastering Mario's movement throughout the different stages, but it differs from a handful of games because of how it maintains consistent the world building through the iterations between mechanics and their interference in Mario's momentum, as I discussed. Mario focuses in finding beauty in the sheer act of playing, which is amazing in and of itself, yet there are glances in its game design that indicate a contrast between contemplation and pragmatic. This conflict of opposites is largely present in Zelda games, both in a gameplay and narrative level. I said there is more proximity to the nature of rules in the process of learning in Mario games, and the 4-step design plays a major role in that. More than just an adventure game, Zelda builds its tone around constant, slow-paced puzzle solving. There's no great spectacle in puzzle solving, just learning, association, thinking, etc. Yet the 4-step design isn't that distant from Zelda's dungeon design. Let's take a look at one of the most fully fledged out dungeons of the series, the Ancient Cistern from Skyward Sword. What's special about the Ancient Cistern is the focus on one central hub. Every room, in a way, leads to the same place, which makes every separate room feel cohesively integrated in the dungeon space as a whole. Entering the cistern immediately shows a locked door and some floating plants, which serve as platforms. Under the water, the player finds some silver rupees on the statue's hands. Getting these rupees makes the statue's hands close, revealing a pattern in the fingers. What's interesting is that the first level of the central hub reveals different moments of the dungeon's linear progression. There's always a sense of objective navigation, but in this dungeon, some of it is not simply locked doors. There's a giant fish mouth, for example, and even the sheer sublime aspect of the Buddha arouses some curiosity for what's on the top, complemented by the drawing of a giant flower on his head. The first door has the player drop from a high spot on a plant platform, which makes it turn upside down. That's an introduction to a new mechanic, which is followed by 2 enemy spiders. These enemies were introduced earlier in the game, but the dungeon will have a particular use for them, so I'll count them as a particular mechanic of the cistern. Another room has the same mechanic being further developed, where the underwater part of the floating plant blocks the way to other rooms. This fits in the skeleton as the first and second step, where a mechanic is introduced and further developed. And what's especially interesting is that the room's layout is always directly related to it, even in an extremely simple manner. After getting the key, Link has to return to the central hub and open the locked door that leads to the statue's interior. Some deactivated valves foreshadow a new mechanic, but what's characteristic of this room is verticality. On the bottom, the player fights with the dungeon sub-boss and acquires the whip, which is first used to activate the valves. This is a very versatile mechanic, since it can be used on multiple objects. The 3 main iterations are all presented in the central room. The whip can be used to swing around, like the grappling hook in Wind Waker, to pull a leveler, and, the most important one, to flip the floating plants. There's both the second step, because of the whip's versatility, and the third step, where a previous mechanic is integrated with another one, and everything happens in the main room of the dungeon. Pulling the leveler allows Link to enter the fish's mouth, leading him to a room with a giant pool in the middle. This is an interesting room, both because there's an introduction to a new mechanic and the interaction between 2 little mechanics, the leveler and the stick. Mainly they serve to develop the whip mechanic, but the dungeon recognizes them as individual mechanics themselves. This interaction configures the third step of the skeleton. After Link's flush down the pool, the dungeon reveals its dark side. By itself, it enhances the overall tone of the Ancient Cistern. Back to the notion of how the Buddha arouses some curiosity about what's on top, the hellish underground acts as a nice contrast. The room has some floating platforms and 3 spiders at the top of them. Using the beetle, the player can make them drop on the plants, making them turn upside down. It's always clever to articulate an enemy with certain mechanics, like the Paracupas being used as platforms in Super Mario. Here, we have yet again the third step, where the spiders were introduced right at the beginning to be later integrated with another element of the dungeon's mechanical context. Before the next room, the player takes a glance at a large treasure chest, once again punctuating a sense of pragmatism. The next room takes the player back to the upper part of the temple. Everything involving spatial and mechanical design is very well articulated in this room, but there is nothing new going on. After solving the puzzle, Link reaches the upper side of the main area and uses the whip on the lever, making the giant statue move to the underground section. The dungeon made an amazing job with creating spatial context because of how it integrated every room and mechanic with the central room, but it never asked the player to deeply understand the overall layout in order to progress. It's pretty much as easy as realizing that, in the Great Deku Tree, verticality must be used as a tool for progression, making the player drop down on the spider's web that covers a hole on the ground. This time, the inner verticality of the Buddha must be associated with how the dungeon is divided between a surface and underground level. It may not ask for that much thinking of spatial distribution, like with the Water Temple and Snowhead, but it's still charming. But what's a bit disappointing is that the solution to the large chest puzzle is written in a stone tablet. Having the statue's movement interfere in more ways than simply connecting the two spaces is great in and of itself, because it further develops the notion of a spatial context. Still, it would have been better to let the player connect the dots by him or herself. Finally, after acquiring the big key, Link reaches the top of the dungeon to fight the boss. Since the dungeon established certain obstacles that required constant exploration, there is always a solid sense of objectivism and linearity, contrasting with the mechanical and spatial design that makes everything so harmonically articulated. It attaches the player to an external wonder that feels delightful by how imaginatively intricate and cohesive it is. The end goal is always clear, but the mechanics often require a non-stop learning from the player. Since interactions are frequent, mechanics can be apprehended as parts of a whole. They integrate the dungeon's particular context. More than sticking to a linear progression, where the final goal is what catches the player's eye, it asks for an understanding of how its particular parts relate to each other, and that's the same in a geographical sense. By making the player comprehend both its mechanical and spatial context, the dungeon acquires a beauty of its own. It becomes akin to a world that feels interconnected, intricate, and alive. Establishing how much the player cares about the middle, that is, the process of learning and understanding, comes from how much the dungeon asks him or her to understand its whole, be it with mechanics or space. Breath of the Wild is different because of its open world nature, and it has an abundance of shrines to explore. So how are these small and large dungeons designed? Well, Breath of the Wild has only 4 of them that are mandatory, located at the Great Plateau. As the player steps in Hyrule, this chunk of land presents pretty much every sort of variety in overworld exploration the player will encounter. Large peaks, playing empty spaces, boats on freezing rivers, trees that can be used as bridges and pathways for shield surfing, which builds the already discussed idea of a cohesively interconnected space that forms itself through the combination of mechanical versatility and space distribution. Both through the actions and visual splendor, everything is interconnected. So we head to the 4 main shrines and find the same concept built around the 4 main mechanics. Oman Au Shrine, which, just as a curiosity, it's an anagram for Aonuma, revolves around the Magnesis rune. Its first use is to lift a large piece of metal from the ground, just so the player understands the rune's basic utility. The next room is pretty interesting though. There's a wall of stone blocks with a metal cube under one of them, and right behind the player there is another metal cube. Moving the cube results in the stone block dropping down, revealing an enemy at the other side of the wall. The presence of the other metal cube is a bit unclear, but I feel that by placing 2 different cubes in the room, the game persuades the player to find a use to the second one. The enemy can be defeated pretty quickly with weapons, but the falling blocks hints another utility for the rune. It can be used as a weapon. After that, the same piece of metal presented at the beginning of the shrine is used as a bridge. There's no need to manipulate the piece yet, but after traversing it, a gap between 2 platforms demands a reutilization of the improvised bridge. It's not something that requires much thinking, but it's a type of puzzle solving that recalls one thing a gaming journalist called Michael Thompson once said. It feels as simple as being handed a Rubik's Cube 2 twists away from being solved, and yet, that's an approach to design that makes every act seem both revolutionary and easily attainable. What was just a movable object in the way becomes an assisting tool for progress. Yet the shrine first simply shows this type of iteration with the mechanic to, then, demand a proper action from the player. There is such a multiplicity of iterations drawn in such a brief moment, it's almost symphonic. Within the context of the shrine, it's the second reinterpretation of a single mechanic, The first being its utility as a weapon, but this time it coordinates with the shrine's layout. Yet since the bridge is already there, and there is no demand of any player input other than traverse it, comprehending how the layout interacts with the piece of metal comes just a bit after. It's the first and second steps of the 4-step design happening in the space of seconds. That is, basic learning of a new iteration and its development through an understanding of its relation with space. If it wasn't enough, the player is rewarded for looking out of curiosity to the upper left side of the shrine with a treasure chest, in the same fashion as how picking at different spots in the overworld leads the player to new discoveries and a constant feeling of surprise. Just how Link's movement allows for a level of interaction that alienates new mechanics, which is translated in a focus of spatial understanding, the development of merely 4 main mechanics allows every shrine to acknowledge headfirst the player's understanding of the rune's versatile uses and build a web of mechanical and space interactions that, sometimes, is immediately complex. The player's role is to get scared of this complexity, to later understand the interactions and connect the dots, which is essentially an exercise of understanding the context. From memory, one of the shrines that best illustrates this design method is Rata Shrine. The 3 main elements of the dungeons are this spinning laser, a switch, and a water level. Raising the water has the player cross the area using crayones, only to find a metal box that must hit a switch on the floor, but the box weight isn't enough to create impact underwater. That's the first moment the player is pulled out of linearity and asked to understand how every mechanic interacts with each other, resulting in backtracking. This part of the puzzle isn't that hard, but after reaching the end of the shrine, there's a treasure chest located at a high place. The player needs to find a way to traverse the main area, lower the water level, and raise it again, so the chest becomes reachable. That's when the bomb comes in, and thanks to its nature of non-automatic explosion, the player can leave it close to the switch until he gets to the end of the shrine. So the level raises and, using crayones, the player gets to the chest. It's pretty interesting to design a shrine that entices the player to move forward only to show that its mechanisms are more complex than they seemed. But it's thanks to the versatility of the bomb mechanic that the mechanical and spatial context of the shrine can be further developed to a point of smart complexity and beauty. Yet, later shrines will even avoid the use of runes and focus on more subtracted manners of imitating the player's relation to the world of Hyrule. Something as simple as Shelwarvo Shrine that maintains an almost insulting linearity through its progress to later give a simple yet effective twist where the player has to look at the backside of a structure to proceed, or Vulura Shrine where the player is thrown at an abrupt change of scenario, further reinforces elements present in exploration, some of which can be described as looking at the back of a rock, or abruptly changing focus because of a flaming dragon, a shooting star, or a spirit animal that appears in the horizon. As for the dungeons, this last approach of emphasizing surprise is pretty much their main theme. In the midst of flying dragons and foggy forests, the player will locate a flying mechanical bird, a trunk that spits water, a reptile walking on a volcano, and a sandstorm being caused by a mechanical camel. They are yet another wonder that's eye-sighted, but they have their own shrine-like enigmas. What's unique about the Divine Beast's dungeon design is how it punctuates the first impressions they incite when located in the overworld. For all except Rudonia, large sections let the player look at the land that surrounds the beasts, emphasizing how they stand first as a part of the world rather than an objective placed in a linear progression. But most important, all of them, with the exception of Naboris, reinforces the feeling of wonder and surprise with the usage of each beast's particular activity in the world as a main mechanic. When Meadow is spotted, it flies through the sky. When boarded, wind is a main mechanic of the dungeon, be it the simple ventilation that create a current from the ground or the strong currents that affect the dungeon's interior. Also, the player is seen paragliding here and there to reach different areas, and considering Meadow itself can be seen from almost any point of the map, which may characterize it as one of, if not the most mysterious wonder of the game's world, looking at the whole kingdom from above creates a catharsis that's unmatched by any other visual splendor in the game. The wonder felt from sighting the beasts in the overworld, when attached to the dungeon's spatial and mechanical design, emanates an idea of the natural overcoming the mechanical. That is, the beauty of the thing itself is more valuable than accomplishing any objective. It gives emphasis to the player's subjective impulse of reaching a mystery that seems so distant from reality, yet so easily tangible. There's no spectacle in the player's actions, because the world takes all the attention to itself. Weapons acquired break, so what's the great luxury of having an arsenal that won't last? Aside from helping the player survive, what's the point in collecting Korok seeds if the player may eventually use the treasured weapon so to not risk his life against a Lino? What's actually rewarding in Breath of the Wild? It's a question with many answers, and that's all for the better. This may be a good time to dive into the narrative. Building this vivid world and emphasizing how wondrous little details can be isn't something Breath of the Wild decided to implement out of nowhere. I said Zelda always attempted to build an understanding of the game's world that conflicted with a cold sense of progression, but for what purpose? Let's go back in time for a while. We start as a young boy, the only one without a fairy in a forest of kids. Asked by the Great Deku Tree to embark on an adventure to save the land of Hyrule, we leave important ones behind to help other tribes with their matters. From the very beginning, Link is depicted as an outsider, displaced from his Kokiri fellows and diametrically different from the Gorons and Zoras. The first moment of the game has our protagonist returning to the forest to find Saria, gaining the trust to be called the Brother Goron by Darunia, and conquering the love of the Zora princess. The spiritual stones are merely goals that divide events in a straight line. What really matters are the deviances. Revisiting an important friend, being smashed to the ground by the brute force of a Goron, and drawing non-linear paths at Jabu Jabu's belly to find and carry Ruto as she constantly complains about everything matter more than the objective context surrounding them. Following how the growth of this material, affectionate feud between Link and his new and past characters is drawn, the game expands the sense of a cohesive world that preserves self-sufficiency and intricate beauty. Creating a minimalistic direction makes every area in the game become, visually, part of a whole, rather than just separate places in a linear progression. It makes everything much more mundane, even the temples. When visiting Saria, the forest temple is presented way before the moment Link has to enter it, like a mystery that's eye-sighted with no objective function other than simply arousing curiosity. 7 years later, Ganondorf emerges victorious, and adult Link has to travel through past visited lands, as well as new ones, to awaken the sages. At this point, the important laces established with past characters become less of a genuine moment of friendship and more of a scripted event, since they acquire a greater role in the hero's myth. What was once a deviation, a moment of attachment to another one, is now just a memory. That's when Ocarina shows how its mechanics tells the story. The idea of looking at the characters as oneself that exists independently correlates to a world building that has it as something more than a piece of land that exists just as a means to get to the end. In this sense, the dungeons follow the same idea. By creating their particular mechanical and spatial context, they acquire a self, as opposed to being just a surpassed obstacle. As a child, these dungeons are shorter, and their context unfolds in simple yet effective manners. As described with the Great Deku Tree dungeon, spatial context can be built with a quick realization that the dungeon's verticality must be acknowledged, so the player is allowed to proceed. The Dongle's Cavern has a main hub that can be accessed from above, so the player can drop a bomb at the skull's eye. And while Jabu Jabu's belly starts to acquire more complexity in how it builds context, most of the interactions are much more immediately perceived than in later dungeons. And that's because this moment in the game is filled with deviations from rigid objectivism, and the approach to developing genuine affections with other characters is translated in a design that asks for a more attainable understanding of the dungeon's interconnections. The manner in which space and mechanics articulate themselves is so immediately comprehended, it correlates to a sense of humanity having space to manifest itself. And then, the adult phase creates complex mazes where context is harder to understand, which makes reaching the self that more laborious. It ultimately makes objectivity something ephemeral, transitory, as the laws of the world, or the myth in this case, pulls the player back from deviations to focus on an ultimate task. And nostalgia won't be the easy way out. Child Link may represent the better past, yet by the time he's thrown in the scariest place in the game, he joins the same boat as adult Link, having to face the dire consequences the world fell to. That's the point where the immaterial establishes itself as a whimper, lost in time, and the culmination of this occurs in the Spirit Temple, where both Links have to go through the hardships of the temple together. At the end, the hero is left aside, so Link can live a life of his own. What mostly resonates throughout the narrative is how the game forced the past to remain as a memory, and with that, amplify the weight of objectivity so any sort of deviation in the form of emotional attachment could remain special. Further developing this idea, Majora's Mask came to life. Chasing Skull Kid, Link ends up falling in a nightmarish hallucination where he's being chased by a giant Deku. When he comes to, his face shifts to a sad version of the monster that haunted him. Going through a twisted hallway, Link finds a masked salesman with an uncomfortable happy expression, who says he can change Link's current state if he retrieves a lost item that may cause great terror if it falls under the wrong hands. He also tells in 3 days he has to leave, but no explanation is given. And where exactly are we? Who knows? Maybe the gap between the door is a different dimension. The tonality of these first minutes is outstanding, and the best part is the lack of any concrete soil to uncover the mysteries. We don't know where we are, why we turned into a sad Deku, why we find the salesman after the twisted corridor, why we have 3 days to recover his lost item, but we can perfectly understand the game's dramatic structure. The facts, though, are obscure. Going through the door takes us to Termina, a city where everyone has a routine and the clock times the moments of their doom. Link has to play hide and seek with a bunch of children to enter their hideout, so he can acquire an item to give to the merchant and gain access to the top of the clock tower. Meanwhile, a postman can't spare his life because it would go against the rules of his job. Workers argue with the town's guards about whether the moon's falling or not. Circus artists practice here and there, and so on. By the 3rd day, the empty city awaits the carnival. Link stops the Skull Kid and reverses time to the very first day, where everyone's seen going through their normal routine. This is Majora's Mask, and this strange atmosphere kicks in right from the beginning. The game starts by affirming how it is one step ahead of the player. Far from the common method of narrative building, where the events unfold following the protagonist's actions, Clocktown is oppressively complicated right from the start. Not only is the tone of the game established before any type of concrete explanations for the events, people actively react upon the surrounding problems, as opposed to stand still and complain until the player does something. All we see from the start are fragmented moments lived by these people, looping around the same time period. It's an expansion of the idea Ocarina developed, where humanistic sensitivity finds little room to manifest under certain central rules. When approached, these people reveal great complexity and sorrow. But what's the use of helping them if the game forces the player to reverse time? Majora's nature of interactivity immediately distances the player from others on a scale way larger than Ocarina did, because it presents an immediate subjective complexity of the characters, as well as their autonomy. And by establishing how these events occur detached from the main objective, uncovering one's sufferings demands both an active deviation from the main route, as well as a level of consideration to seek out how fragmented moments are parts of a whole. But with the time strain, any help provided by the player is undone after he travels back in time, which is not only a manifestation of the mechanical overlapping the humane, as it forces the player out of deviation, but is also a central point in defining if the player will look at the uselessness of his efforts and stand indifferent to these people, or continue to uselessly exercise an urge for comprehension. Still, Clocktown is only the first area the player has to visit. For the first 3 other areas, each one evokes a strong emotion that becomes much denser when related to each tribe's conflicts, and the art direction deserves special praise in this regard. Woodfall has flashy primary colors, the Purple River being particularly notable as its color grows more intense the closer Link gets to the Deco Palace, where the king is possessed by rage after his daughter's loss, and the monkey's life is in check. Everything is accompanied by a song that evokes pride, authority. Well, listen for yourselves. Goron City is covered in snow, and the extreme cold is putting its inhabitants at risk. The baby Goron cries for his father's absence, who tries to reach his son but keeps being frozen in the way. It creates an overall tone of fear, I'd say. Last, Great Bay has a vast empty sea, reflecting Lulu's silence and solitude, which came after her eggs were stolen. I'll talk about Ikana later, but for now, when it comes to these areas, what's beautiful is how they can perfectly be reduced to one singular, dominant emotion, while simultaneously evoking gasps of other feelings that emanate from the fact there is always a loss of someone involved. The king may feel sadness, but for now, there's only pure rage being exteriorly manifested. as well as sadness can be felt by the Gorons, but fear speaks louder, and fear can be felt by Lulu, yet she mostly expresses loneliness. I am being a bit arrogant by giving certainty to which emotions are evoked in these areas. For some, they may evoke other main emotions different from the ones I interpreted, yet there's always a sense of extreme loss of composure that reaches a level of human fragility where no rationality can be seen, like an overvoltage of subjectivity that makes it both viable as well as unfeasible to think one's feelings can be summarized in one single emotion. From here, acknowledging how the feelings in Termina revolve around an imminent loss of everything will most likely create some interest in going after Clocktown citizens. But when visiting these areas, the player also finds Mikal and Hermione, two characters that, in face of the anguish felt for their fails in saving someone important to them, ask for Link to heal their sorrows, materializing their spirits in a mask. In fact, almost every main side quest has Link acquiring masks after helping people with their sorrows. And the most interesting part is that these masks are game mechanics themselves. The transformation masks are mandatory if the player wants to progress in the game, yet they always carry the overall thematic of humanity. Like Ocarina, they are memories of deviations, but present in a much larger scale. Mikal and Hermione are only freed when their fails are left aside, keeping memories as their most treasured reward, and that's essentially Link's journey as he constantly fails to save everyone in Termina, in an eternal process of useless efforts that can only be seen as not meaningful if memories can't be seen as a type of reward themselves. Different from how most games build meaning based on the player's influence in the world, Majora's builds meaning on how the world influences a player who can't help but to fail again and again and again. Which leads us to think of how strong Ikana's imagery is. The land is covered with dead creatures, as to say that what ties someone to the world of the living isn't just being alive. The king's regret over the distorted hearts of his people, Kita's concern for his soldiers, the brother's anger and sadness, all ties to the notion that life is less about a straight line to the end and more about what's timeless. Like such, playing the game isn't about reaching the goal, but preserving what's seen in the middle. In this case, looking at its mechanics less as tools for achieving success and more as reminiscences of the past. This denial of a perfect linearity expressed both narratively and mechanically is what makes Majora's feel so special and such a great departure from the series' standards that would help set the tone for future games. The same way it incites the player to invest in the characters and acknowledge how they stand as human beings, or well, Goron, Zora, skeleton beings, it also has a world that stands as something independent. So by the time Link stops the moon, it does so by summoning the ancient giants that are tasked to protect the land. So even if this is the only successful deed of the player, what happens is essentially a successful call for help. Stopping the moon won't solve anyone's problems, other than preventing their death. The questions whether Anju and Kafei will reunite, the Gorons will be saved, the postman will live a life of his own, well, that's not up to Link. Thinking about something Eiji Onuma said about Majora's helps understand where the player stands at the end. It was more a hero story there, in Ocarina. In this particular case, we're looking at a slightly different way to tell that, which is that the sadness of this world can also rise a hero. Maybe Link is even more of an outsider this time. There's an apprehension of the other as someone extremely distant, which comes in the form of a strong absorption of stunning subjective reaction from these characters, only to ultimately not save them yourself. The world's cohesion is kept intact when Link calls for help, yet there is space for one single heroic act, slaying Majora. When it's done, the world proceeds to deal with its problems without Link. Nowhere the events can be seen as achievements, just learning, a process of approaching the unknown and living with no material reward, just personal transformation. The deviations from the mechanical grow larger and larger as Majora's narrative unfolds, while Ocarina would only set punctual events where an acknowledgement of humanity matters more than going from point A to B. The game consistently keeps mundane beauty expressed through dungeon and overworld design, but it disappoints with a narrative that consists of a conservative structure where every action leads to a better ending. The challenge, after Majora, is to revisit the classic myth with a more sensible approach in making the transitory yet timeless moments of humanity reshape how the player interacts with the game. This leads us to Wind Waker, when for the first time the overworld itself is seen as a powerful narrative tool. We start again as young Link, living in an island surrounded by endless seas. He lives a normal life with his younger sister, his grandmother, and the local inhabitants, until a pirate girl falls into the forest after being kidnapped by a monster bird that later kidnaps Arrow, prompting Link to leave his homeland to save his sister. This already creates a small change in the overall focus of the series. The call to adventure shifts from the legend to the mundane. Link isn't tasked to play any role, just to save someone beloved to him, and the prologue does an amazing job to both develop Arrow's character as well as the world around her. Arrow has a telescope as her most precious possession, and she uses it in a very playful manner, as it's depicted at the moment she finds Link only feet away from her, but nevertheless, the telescope still functions as her connection to a world of imagination. Her character really doesn't need more than that. There's already enough subjectivity being portrayed, and it definitely doesn't feel out of place, because the world itself, the ocean's vast nothingness, opens a lot of room for a more discursive characterization. Instead of a generic land of mountains, forests and rocks, the Great Sea feels so unknown that any projection of one's imagination becomes achievable. Not only Ariel is wonderfully portrayed as a child in her world, this ocean grows as something so influential that it ultimately affects how the player interacts with the story on a surface level. When boarding the pirate ship, there's no sign of outset on the horizon, and the jump to Forsaken Fortress and Windfall is so abrupt it further reinforces a sense of disorientation, complementing the ocean's vastness. There's always an attention to how the player reacts to the world around him, or her, and that's the rule when it comes to character development as well. A lot of characters in Windfall reinforce an aspect of isolation with their social interactions. Some spread gossip, others create a gang, or silently explore others' private lives. My favorite, though, is Mrs. Joy's obsession with joy pendants. There's a sign on her wall with what's seemingly a description of joy as an emotional manifestation, but as numbers start to appear, it becomes more and more artificial. Later in the game, we find out she has her own oasis with her own fake butler, and looking at how the higher the number of joy pendants, the higher the joy, it's far too ironic that giving her 40 pendants has, as a reward, a treasure charge, which is the most unexceptional reward in the game. It's isolation translated into strong individualism, complementing the fact that these characters have a fear of leaving the island. On the other hand, the Widow and Calrox, particularly Medley and Makar, as well as Tetra herself and the pirates to some degree, translate the act of literally leaving their islands into more compassionate and empathetic interactions with other ones, as opposed to a self-centered characterization. Medley tries to help both Baloo and Kamali. Tetra shows concern for Outset and follows Link to his second visit to Forsaken Fortress. Makar plays his violin? I don't know, but he's a nice fellow. And the pirates later show to be more compassionate than they first seemed, as it's depicted in a letter from Arrow. All this creates a notion that these characters are so actively present in their world, they become reflections of its physicality. If Majora dealt with Dan's individual complexities, Wind Waker has the player understand the state of the world by how its nature affects its people. In both cases, the game preserves singularity, be it the singularity of a person moments before his or her doom, or the singularity of the physical world. This creates a scenario of constant learning. The other, another self, be it person or land, transforms the player, and of course, none of it would be effective if the game didn't touch on the topic of pragmatic progression. Wind Waker first introduced its story with a tale of a kingdom that fell in ruins after its people dependence on a hero. From the start, it's pretty obvious who's going to pose as this story's hero, but Link is just a normal kid in his world. The green tunic, once worn by the legendary hero, is too warm for this weather. On a mechanical level, it is an archetype of Karina's raising difficulty or Majora's oppressive demand of time management. It keeps things simple, at first. Objectivity is mostly portrayed in dungeon design, pretty much at the same fashion I described earlier, micro-objectives that are spread throughout the dungeon that require further exploration before they can be solved. Yet, even that is not enough to pose as a substantial contrast to the player's attachment to the world. Dragonroot's Cavern sporadically shifts the focus to external sessions, where progression can be paused so the player takes the time to look at the ocean, and Medley is found at a later portion, where she gives Link the grappling hook. The final effect is a dungeon that seems even more a part of a larger context. Also, navigation in the ocean is extremely slow-paced and mechanically simplistic, so the world can be absorbed by the player with little to non-interruption. Different from its predecessors, objectivity becomes more intrusive after a story segment is presented. It begins with the Tower of the Gods, which Link has to conquer in order to prove himself as a hero. As opposed to other dungeons in the game, and maybe in the series, the tower has little to none development of spatial context. Meaning, aside from how its mechanics are developed, it's one straight line to the end, with no demand of the player's understanding of how space is constructed, which makes perfect sense given how it poses as a great task for the character. Even if the mechanics are beautifully articulated, there's a sense of growth depicted in the dungeon that turns it into a sequence of achievements, largely because of the use of verticality. Conquering the final boss has Link descend into the bottom of the ocean, reaching the ruins of Hyrule Kingdom. Or, in other words, the sequence has Link ascending the tower to be proven a hero, and descending the ocean to find the ruins of a land that was destroyed for relying too much on a hero. This acknowledgement is followed by a general shift in the player's perception of the world. The past sense of singularity is pierced by the image of Hyrule destroyed, as if the ocean can't stand as a world of its own without evoking a post-apocalyptic notion. The result is a drastic change in the previous form of pragmatic interaction. Every task given to Link may pretty much be a step forward in risking the present world's existence. Or, to put things more clearly, playing the role of the hero may pretty much kill everyone just like it happened years ago. As if it wasn't enough, characters such as Tetra, Medley, and Makar are recontextualized into the hero's journey, redirected from real beings to figures in a mythological tale. Yet there's a bittersweet happiness coming from Medley and Makar, as well as a genuine compassion from Tetra. The defining empathy of these characters still remains, as well as the same approach to an almost mechanical inexistence in navigation, a dungeon design that creates spatial context as opposed to the Tower of the Gods, and a general maintenance of cohesion in the world itself, as expressed by how a non-linear navigation that comes with the search for treasures and the Triforce hunt has the player revisit past areas, which makes them feel more realistically present in the ocean as opposed to simply isolated moments in the game's progression. And so, the contrast between a formalized play and the player's visceral connection to the game's world becomes much more prominent, even with no substantial change in the mechanical sphere. When Link descends to the ruins of Hyrule to fight Ganondorf, Tetra dreams of oceans as far as the eyes can see, punctuating how distant from Princess Zelda she is, how entire different worlds and eras separate them. Even the antagonist sets himself apart from the formulaic, unquestionable evil being, and shows how his disregard for the present world is a result of his people suffering in the past world. Ganondorf is as much a character greatly influenced by the world around him as any other. Aside from his supernatural capacity of turning into a terrifying puppet, he's pretty much as mundane as the guy with a telescope. In the end, the one character whose function is essentially of support drowns his land forever and dies along with it, only to give the present world a future. It's pretty amazing how the final act of overcoming the mechanical comes with a shift on a supporting character, whose existence throughout a great portion of the game is predominantly mechanical. When Link leaves his home to journey with Tetra, maybe then we can think about a hero that rises not from the myth, but from the present world, just like in Majora. So considering how Wind Waker turned what were previously just punctual manifestations of humanity in Ocarina into a much more intimate and less protagonist-centered experience, while keeping the same narrative structure as the former, how would later games further develop the direction Wind Waker established? Well, the next two entries will definitely capitalize on a narrative dynamic similar to Wind Waker's. That is, focus on world building and a story development that incites reinterpretation and perspective changes. So given how that gasp of a departure from Manichaeism wasn't deeply developed, the chance to further explore this aspect came with Twilight Princess. For the first time, Link starts the game as an adult, and the art direction changed from the vibrant cartoonish style of the Wind Waker to a monotonous realism, and while these seem merely cosmetic changes, they do reflect on the game's narrative direction. Right from the start, it's clear how much Twilight Princess stays at a comfort zone, which ultimately works for its detriment. The initiative in creating a narratively dense overworld is left aside, reintroducing the player to the same old concept of an adventure inland. Ordon Village is where we start, and aside from how well enough it depicts a bucolic atmosphere, there's a general mediocrity to everything else. The lack of an interesting concept for the world results in less room for interesting character development. As opposed to how the Great Sea complemented Arrow's character, the children of Ordon can't be seen as part of their physical world in the same regard, and unfortunately, their development lacks any type of personality. They pose as an almost grotesque caricature of infantile children, reduced to flat, festive characters that serve only to propel a focus on the protagonist's image. And the rest falls to the same rule. There's an overabundance of small tasks to complete that feel so overwhelmingly dull, it hardly helps creating any type of significant bond between Link and the villagers. And Ilia's development is so engrossingly generic and excessively dramatic, it reaches a level of melodrama I never thought I'd see in a Zelda game. Such a level of mechanical artificiality and shallow character development makes the prologue seem almost like a desperate attempt in making the protagonist so unquestionably likable it ends up hurting everyone around him, and it's so annoyingly worse than Majora in Wind Waker or even Ocarina that only a diametrical shift in tonality could compensate it. And surprisingly, that's exactly what happens. After Link is kidnapped and taken to the Twilight World, we're introduced to Midna, a sarcastic and unpleasant creature of the Twilight who's also our new companion. As we find our way out of the underground, the spirits of royal guards appear trembling in fear, foreshadowing the reveal of Hyrule Castle, deprived of light and infested with Twilight beasts. At the main tower, we find Zelda, who tells of the Twilight's invasion in the Light World. Although being a creature of Twilight, Midna shows no hostility towards Zelda, and vice versa. There's a general opposition not only to the welcoming atmosphere of Ordon, but also to its sense of familiarity, as if Link's dragged into a world far wider than his home. Even with how oppressive and threatening the Twilight seems, Link still has to carry one of its creatures on his back as a somewhat trustworthy companion. And the fact that large events are presented to the player first as contextual matters of the world, rather than in a sequence of objectives, already establishes a great distancing with the game's world. Half-answered questions regarding who's Midna, if she's trusty or not, or why the Twilight invaded the Light World, demands further learning from the player. This indicates what's probably the single redeeming quality of the prologue. Since it kept everything simple, there was a general sense of familiarity, so a sudden change to a hostile, unknown atmosphere with an increased narrative complexity reinforces how ordinary Link is. Rather than watching complexity unfold through his eyes, the world is already one step ahead. This is majorly reflected through gameplay, where portions of the map need to be first accessed and explored under the Twilight. The first signs of how the narrative will unfold come with a great artistic direction for the Twilight. Even if taken for granted that it has an antagonistic aura, the Twilight's yellow, obfuscated sky feels like a repressed light, being even darker than the nights of the Light World. It's a great narrative complement to the fact that the Twilight beasts stole Hyrule's light, not because they lack it, but were deprived of it. It's not likely the player will make these connections at first, but it's safe to say there's a sense of mystery and even serenity attached to this world. The music reinforces this with a melodically simple and gentle tune, while still carrying a gasp of suspense. It kinda goes out of the way of an antagonistic feel, so it creates an interesting contrast with the fears and anguishes lived by the people's spirits. Yet, there's still a lack of substantial interaction with the world around coming from Midna, who grows fonder of Link's presence with time, but it's only during the end of each dungeon that she drops her sarcasm to open herself to Link. It would only benefit how the Twilight is apprehended by the player if Midna's concern were to be brought during navigation. But as for her character, there's a noticeable change in her unpleasantness when entering the Lanayru region, and even her moments of consideration being brief, the later segment where she's near death and the most beautiful variation of her theme plays builds a great compassion for the character. And the sections in the Light Road incite even more affectionate attachments from the player. It's only natural to have Link returning to Ordon after Kakariko, so there's a chance to relieve the anguish of its inhabitants by telling them the children are alive, and the Lanayru section greatly enhances world building, creating some better development in the sense of a spatial context. The children have some contact with the Zora race because of Rollis. Kakariko acquires an aspect of a safe zone, and Telma tells Link about a small resistance group in Hyrule, which is yet another fact that's first and foremost mundane, and by consequence, distant from the player's knowledge. But there are some fair amount of flaws. Twilight Princess's overworld becomes even more narratively empty as the game goes on. There's fast-paced navigation with a dull imagery of a generic land of green fields and rocks, water, wooden bridges, etc., and the lack of substantial character development coming from Ilia and the children, as well as a revival of Ocarina's simplistic depiction of conflicts as punctual problems with immediate solutions, downgrades the experience to what feels like a mechanical constancy of objective solving. It's as if there's an imbalance between a direction that prioritizes achieving goals and one that lures the player's attention into learning the world's particularities, as well as its people's singularities. It honestly annoys me how there's an overabundance of mirroring the game's protagonist in the children's development. Colin and Tyler are pretty much reduced to their admiration for Link, and Beth translates this admiration into a stupidly depicted platonic passion. At least Mallow sets himself apart and becomes that comic relief Zelda games tend to execute so well. Ilia also remains engrossingly generic and underdeveloped, being the perfect idyllic love that's so desperate to be likable, it becomes pathetic. With the end of the first half, there's some shift in the player's contextual comprehension. The Twilight isn't seen anymore as the antagonist the light being said it was, and there's even some discontent created with their despotic act of banishing Midna's tribe to another world. It would be even better if the second half continued to further develop this change of perspective with more interactions with the light spirits, but they just vanish from the plot. Again, yet another sign of the game's general inconsistency, but I have to give a gigantic praise to the dungeons of the second half. I've argued a lot about how the dungeons serve as a sort of metonymical depiction of the game's design and narrative choices, but these ones are almost as surprising as Stone Tower was back in Majora's Mask. Snow Peak Ruins has an amazing development of spatial context, and a parallel narrative that's genuinely sweet. The Temple of Time turns its linearity upside down, and asks for a backwards revisiting of every area with a new mechanic that changes pretty much every past iteration with certain mechanics. And last, but not least, City in the Sky is both conceptually brilliant, given how it revolves around a discrete game mechanic that becomes a contextualized character in the world, and design-wise amazing, and its uniqueness comes from developing the player's visual range, so everything, even the boss, can be seen from distinct points. More than just their uniqueness in dealing with spatial and mechanical context, there's a tangential, and in the Temple of Time, persistent idea of perspective change, be it with the lovely ending of the Snowhead's temple or in the sheer idea of amplifying a mechanical entity's presence in the world into something more substantial. And this exercise of perspective change acts only to the benefit of the experience as a whole. As we head to the game's conclusion, Zan's character goes from an undeniably threatening villain to a pathetic power-hungry fool, throwing him out of the formula of good versus evil and making him a reflection of the world's matters, a humane character. The rest is pretty much just monomythical. Ganon happens to be the main villain, and Link ultimately defeats him. But the actual ending has Midna biting an eternal farewell to her partner and Princess Zelda. I see her act of destroying the Mirror of Twilight as the perfect conclusion to the plot, because it further reinforces how much her character was affected by the conflicts revolving her people. And this type of bittersweet ending is a departure from predictability that punctuates the game's attempt to leave a protagonist-centered experience and approach mundane complexity. It's unfortunate that Twilight's Princess flaws gets in the way of the experience, but the direction it took with developing Wind Waker's concept of perspective change resulted in an overall excellent game. The main difference in how both entries develop narrative complexity comes with the roughness of their twists. Wind Waker hits hard with one major twist that drastically changes the player's view of the world and the mechanics. Twilight Princess adds some mystery with the Twilight and softens the departure from the formulaic with less extravagant twists, creating a constant uneasiness that never reaches the apocalyptical. None's better than the other, it ultimately comes to proper execution, but with Twilight Princess, there's a depiction of hidden complexities that's more spread out throughout the whole. And that's a perfect gap to start talking about the black sheep of the bunch. When it comes to character development, this one pretty much matches Majora's Mask. There's an intrinsic complexity to every character, built around some campiness and satirical humor. Real love is unobtrusively manifested through meaningful friendship, reinforced by repetition. In this case, Zelda pushing Link down a cliff twice. Rather than thinking of its characters as dehumanized shells that carry immediately recognizable emotions and subjective complexities, Skyward Sword creates a contrast between the external and the interior, establishing certain feelings as deeply intimate. More importantly, it's yet another step in developing the concept of disbelief in what's shown, akin to the Wind Waker shift in the player's perception of the ocean, and Twilight Princess achieving the same with the Twilight World. It's a mixture of this game's world building and Majora's character development in a way. On the scope of satirical humor, there's this same aspect of hidden complexity previously described. Skyward Sword compensates for Twilight's poor development of the mythological tale and brings it to the limelight. The goddess is referenced all around. There are magical elemental dragons, man-made structures disrupting natural environments, as well as our typical vassal of the goddess and a servant of the main antagonist. But most of all, there's the weight of a major task that constantly gets in the way of Link and Zelda's reunion. The formula is established, but following the concept of exterior personalities clashing with interior feelings, Fi and Girahim, the two servants, are developed as to show how unsustainable this formula really is. The first lacks emotion and exaggeratedly creates calculations for everything. The last is so overwhelmingly self-centered he becomes sexually extravagant. The excess of objectivity never quite fits with the comical and subjective heavy portrayal of the characters, or the intimate and intricate overworld design. This creates some great moments, like Fi being hit on by a Lanayru robot and expressing nothing more than suspension points, or her strange estimative that Akikui has any chance at all of being Zelda. Finally, the depiction of what's humanly uncomfortable makes Girahim so uniquely weird, he becomes as mundane a discomfort as any intrusive, normal stranger, instead of an almighty evil that solely expresses hate. Everything leads to the notion of mundane normality, from every character interaction to the overworld design. It's a wonderfully focused narrative. I already discussed the qualities of the three main areas of the game, but yet, not regarding their involvement in one of the game's greatest moments of mechanical interaction, the Silent Realms. After a final encounter with Zelda that doesn't last long enough to even be considered bittersweet, she travels through time to continue her task. Now, even more distant from his friend, Link travels back to the Three Lands to conquer the goddess tests. Considering how the first visiting of these areas were structured around simplistic tasks that were obfuscated by an approach to design that made these worlds feel alive and singular on their own regards, the Silent Realms pose as a twist in the player's perception, adding more objective complexity to navigation. The interconnected design of foreign woods becomes a setting for a test of mastery in spatial recon, instead of simply a means to build cohesion and intimacy. The verticality in Eldin brings uneasiness, since because of its less interconnected design, the player needs to walk long, linear paths to get back to a certain point, and given the time strain, it acquires some level of precise execution. Ascending the volcano first builds some expectation on the player, but in the Silent Realm it becomes an exercise of accuracy, especially when it comes to stamina management. Finally, the vastness of Lanayru makes navigation harder, because the absence of verticality throws away any sense of linear exploration. Most of the player's work is done with little to none regard of spatial interconnection, which sets strategic thinking aside and focuses on a high-risk, high-reward navigation, punctuating how overwhelming it is to see the tiers scattered through the land and not have the slightest idea where to start. It's a turning point in the narrative. The distancing with a figure that embodies emotional attachment is translated in an intrusively pragmatic gameplay that repels contemplation, similar to the realization that the sea in Wind Waker is pretty much a giant carpet that hides a ruined past. Skyward Sword never embraces a grim tone, neither unravels itself into a darker place. It stays true to the fact that it seems like a typical fairy tale on the surface. The next areas, aside for one, never develop themselves sufficiently enough to feel like memorable discoveries. Instead, the game takes the player to a process of revisiting the main sections of each land. Not an hour after reaching Lake Floria, the player is thrown back at Foreign Woods to search for the sacred water, and with the way to the Fire Sanctuary blocked, the player needs to guide Scrapper all the way to the top of the volcano. Even if not super exciting tasks, they show an attempt to counterhand the typical notion of progression. By emphasizing backtracking, each stationary area accompanies the linear progression of the narrative, acquiring a level of dynamic storytelling that only further reinforces their impact on the player's subjective involvement. Player growth followed by world expansion is the mechanical translation of a typical hero's narrative, but Skyward Sword is much more than that. It breaks the norm by demanding backtracking, taking the player to account the existence of previous areas at every turn, which again depicts the mundane overlaying the objective. The norm only exists with the Sensi, yet there's such a brilliant expansion of the time travel mechanic, it comes as a perfect inclusion to Lanayru's overall narrative. It's filled with contextualization revolving the pirates, with gentle touches of humanization, and the Sensi vastness contrasts amazingly well with the small area surrounding the boat that evokes the past. But for every piece of game design in the second half, there's but one thing that shines when it comes to narrative. Initially depicted as the aggressive, self-imposing bully, Gruz shows to be a fragile, sensitive and silly character, following the same concepts of intimacy clashing with external personality. After Zelda's disappearance, Gruz retires from his manly arrogance to cry in his room, later deciding to follow Link to the surface. On the surface, he still pretends to be the perfect protagonist, but ultimately fails to keep up with his intended heroism. It's not until the end of the second part of the game that Gruz embraces a supporting role, coming up as someone who discovers his passionate personality, emphasizing a genuine concern for Zelda, which he always had, but was obscured by a concern for himself. Gruz symbolizes the end of the protagonist, or rather, the idea of the protagonist. On a character development level, he goes through the inverted process of the player. When there's intimacy being built with the world, Zelda, or the surface tribes, Gruz poses as a counterexample, the self-complacent character. But when the mechanical starts to overlay the natural, Gruz comes as the argument for humanity. The game always maintains a balance, never ceasing to change the player's acceptance of things. The myth acquires tremendous weight when Zelda reveals her identity. Yet, when she enters her sleep, there's still a moment to express how, other than Hylia, Zelda is still her own self. So the game heads to its conclusion as the player travels back to the three main areas, conquers the last silent realm, and descends to the surface to deal with Girahim and Demise. Gruz saves Zelda, Link saves the world, and thus, the hero dies. The last moments are dedicated to the servants expressing their care and compassion for their masters, breaking the cold formality of the roles to embrace a genuine affection. As Impa fades away and reveals the resting Master Sword, the game ends. I was in tears by then, but that's no surprise. Skyward Sword has heart. There's a constant multiplicity in perception that evokes both a sense of action and tragedy. It's a game that's not afraid to go to the opposite way of the norm, to attest that a fairy tale can create a tremendous level of learning and compassion. There's brilliant level design, dungeon design, character development, pretty much everything in Skyward Sword is top-notch. Zelda's not new to changes, I mean Majora's Mask is a living proof of that, but the fans felt there was too much recycled content in Skyward Sword. Too much handheld, little exploration, and so on. I didn't talk about boss repetition, but I guess it's pretty obvious where I stand with this. Fighting Girahim 3 times makes him a more narratively relevant villain in the story, which wouldn't be the case if he was simply a challenge at the end of the road, because again, there's more to him than just being an obstacle. As for the Imprisoned, while he's truly not the most enjoyable boss in the game, repetition reinforces a sense of a task Link has to go through, and also, it serves as a guiding stone for Gruz's development. It's pretty hard to attest that more content equals better quality. It's also very complicated to throw aside narrative intentions when talking about game design. Skyward Sword is stupendous, and as much as I love Twilight Princess, it's definitely a better step ahead for the series. So, we travel through the notion of task, that is, objective involvement, clashing with the self, subjective and emotional involvement, first as a gasp, then as a bomb that targeted character development on a very anti-formulaic nature, to further develop the concept with world building in a slightly more formulaic structure, and ultimately, mixing the two in what came to be Skyward Sword. I usually say Zelda games are abstractive. That is, they demand a distancing from personal projections that may interfere in the game's understanding, while still maintaining a deep subjective involvement. With that in mind, let's get back to Breath of the Wild, with what's probably one of the most underrated stories of the last couple of years. One of the questions I raised earlier was, what's actually rewarding in Breath of the Wild? There are enough rules that break with the common idea of player growth. The weapon durability system makes combat more pragmatic than aesthetical, meaning there isn't much ostentation of power if the player may have to rely on a bokoblin arm to survive a fight. Facing a garden can be stupidly hard and laborious if faced like a normal enemy, or a complete walk in the park if the player discovers its laser can be parried, and the ancient arrows are pretty much one-hit kill. It's a challenge that can be easily overcome with pure skill, be it with the pot lead or the Hylian shield, and the ancient arrows are so easily attainable and lore contextualized, as well as absurdly overpowered, they are less of a reward that came with conquering great challenges, and more of a mundane piece of technology that fits in the story. Also in the topic of difficulty, some enemies can be wrecked by certain elemental weapons, making a battle against a powerful fire Lizalfos become trivial, even with the most basic of ice weapons. So there's less action involved and more of the cognitive activity of puzzle solving. Everything creates a notion of survival, ultimately establishing the world as a real threat, a realistic entity, not just a sack of AIs that serve as a playground for a showcase of power. So we have our protagonist, Link, who wakes up after being asleep for 100 years and is tasked to save Hyrule from Calamity Ganon, an evil being that defeated Link, Zelda, and the champions, and now seeks total destruction. It's pretty standard really, but our fallen hero faces one other adversity, a lack of any memory at all. From here on out, the story will be divided in the Champions arc and Zelda's arc, all of which revolving around, at different degrees, recovering lost memories. The structure of the overworld was already discussed, as well as the resulting intimacy with the player, with organic landscape variations and a spatial design that allows for different forms and levels of intimacy. Every mystery comes as something the player wants to get close to. When approaching a city, the player is filled with the anxiety of discovery. On the visual scope, this city belongs in the same world as Calamity Ganon. So by the time the player enters it and discovers about the fate of the champions, the city becomes both a wonder and a contextualized space. At the end of each dungeon, Link meets with the spirits of the fallen champions. There is little screen time with them, but everything in scene draws a level of complexity that only makes sense when their regrets are expressed in their alone moments, glancing at the land of Hyrule. Mipha is kind and caring on the surface, but her music is sad and melancholic. When alone, she looks at her home, distant from her family, with anguish. Daruk exhales confidence and good vibes, but his music suddenly changes from a triumphant tone to a tremendously sad one. Instead of an archetype, there's indication of real care from the character, as it's expressed with his interaction with Yunobo, who's fragile and fearful. Revali, the best of the bunch, is cocky and arrogant, but not only his music indicates some delicacy, and even a melancholic tone, he seems oddly insecure, begging for a compliment that never comes. He also shows a genuine care for Zelda and the world of Hyrule, making him very likable in a variety of ways. Finally, Urbosa stands as a strong, loyal and caring character. Her music is serene, yet with a tone of sadness. There's no further development of their past deeds. The champions are no different from the first sight of a mysterious place in the world. There's no room for rationalization with the unknown. Before being anything concrete, it first arouses some subjective reaction in the player who is only later driven to discover what lies inside. At first, the champions seem to only manifest fragments of their own humanity. Externally, there's an archetype, an almost theatrical depiction of gentle, cool, cocky, and prideful, but brief moments of sorrow, regret, and sadness punctuate a complexity that is not immediately understandable. If a secret may arouse curiosity, expectation, or even a degree of fear in the player, the character's range of one-dimensional emotions may arouse empathy, and the same will of discovery, of understanding, that comes with exploring unknown locations in the world. The difference is, in the main game, we never reach the point of discovery, only speculation. The champions remain incomplete, distant, or rather, dead. That's what makes them special. Their absence is genuinely felt by the player, because in contrast to the intimacy built with the world, they will never become intimate. The care that rises from speculation is a different one, not less meaningful than the one that rises from certainty. It may even be the most genuine. Zelda's arc follows something similar. Every piece of memory expressively depicts an emotional state of her character, be it a great sadness, guilt, happiness, etc. Before everything comes together, there's an initial empathy with a character that's still unknown. But after the final memory, when the princess awakens the hidden power and loses Link, everything acquires a deeper meaning. Her story is of a passionate scholar, delighted by the world's mysteries, but forced to accomplish a task of great importance. Facing failure and loss, she manages to fulfill her role when the world's already facing its doom. Zelda takes the Master Sword to the forest and heads to Hyrule Castle to face Ganon. The basic premise follows the standard narrative of the series. There is a personal, emotional attachment that clashes with an objective task. This is subtly shown in the player's own experience. The game develops a lot of contemplation, and it's mostly characterized by a carefree nature in gameplay. Where it finds room to punctuate formality comes in the same language used to explore contemplation. Hyrule Castle can be spotted from almost any place in the map, standing as a visual reminder of the main objective, which becomes more expressive by the time the divine beasts shoot their sights into the core of the castle. The shrines are a major aesthetic disruption from the natural environment of Hyrule, while also building a lore that greatly revolves around Calamity Ganon. And when there's music, it usually comes in the form of gentle piano pieces, but sometimes a synthesizer breaks into the Pacific tune and generates a contrast. By having objective formality being manifested with almost no significance, a difference is established between Link and Zelda. For her, the weight of obligation is much heavier, and the pain she manifests, which is essentially a result from her being deprived to act by her will alone, connects directly to the player, who experiences an affection for the world of Hyrule that matches Zelda's love for ancient technology, frogs, the Silent Princess, etc. She conducts the narrative in a way that makes her as important as Link himself, ultimately because there's learning involved. Given how Link goes from a loyal knight with little to none room for emotions to a character who, as an extension of the player of course, loses himself in the world's greatest mysteries, or even the most simplistic pleasures, it's like every memory of Zelda's love for the world around her serves as a propeller for developing the player's personal attachment to this same world. That is, seeing a character affected by constant failure with bittersweet moments of genuine compassion makes the world around the player that more beautiful. And that's something that could only work with the fragmented, retrospective nature of storytelling. The first because every moment is brief enough so it acquires the same aspect of ephemeral impact that is characteristic of mostly everything in the world. And the last because a memory is never completely objective, or rather, it's selective, never able to depict every detail of a past event because it focuses on what was special. That way, the direction keeps its focus less on the details and more on the intimate impact of the external on Link and the player. This is something greatly present story, narrative, and gameplay-wise. Fragmentation matches the moment-to-moment wonder of discovery, and the focus on personalities, emotions, struggles and just a personal speculation of facts, never with concrete answers, is what creates a level of intimacy with everything that's external to the player that can be strong even without the whole picture drawn. Having too much details is what separates the story from the discovery and the wanting to discover.
Do you really remember me?
The Champion's Ballad DLC is a bit different from the rest of the game in terms of design, but it achieves some interesting things with what it does. Although it happens in the same time as the rest of the events in the game, returning to the Great Plateau to conquer a tougher challenge than the one at the beginning of the game creates a sense of a part 2, a digression that feels like a whole new thing. The section already feels more linear than the first visit to the plateau, but everything starts to reach the point of offensive objectiveness when the game asks to traverse rings that seem offset from the world around, or throw a ball in the hole Master Koga felt, shoot Zin's horn, hit 4 targets in the flight range, and so on. But it's in the contrast between an excessively straightforward, simplistic objective and the place it is set in that shows what's interesting about the DLC. Every sequence of trial is tied to the champions, and the story is told by Cass, a character that, throughout the main game, interrupts the silent navigation in the overworld to sing his teacher's notes about a secret residing in a close-by area. He's majorly responsible for lore-based storytelling regarding shrines and some other minor secrets. He's something of a guide, someone who helps Link uncover the mysteries of the world, going as far as to reveal a deeply personal emotion of a central character. Keeping that in mind, he's given the role to sing about the champions and reveal more about them. At the end of each trial, Cass plays a music he wrote about each of the champions, triggering a cutscene. What I like about the character's development provided by the Champion's Ballad is that, more than giving details of the champions that could ruin that sense of speculation and uncertainty, it gives more reason to miss them, or rather, it amplifies the will to know more about them. That's evident by how a new personal side of the champions' personalities is shown, while not necessarily the one evoked by their theme songs or monologues. Mipha, for example, doesn't show the sadness that's evoked by her theme song, neither the fragility she depicts when talking to Link. Instead, she shows to be quite fearless and rigorous, while still empathetic and gentle. The Rook doesn't show sadness as well, but fear, which makes his scene with Yunobo even better. Nothing brings more answers about who they are, at least not enough to make them very intimate. Not only their development further reinforces the impact of their loss, but given how they are accompanied by a roughly simplistic gameplay, it immediately turns the spotlight to them. Having these dull tasks happening in places of such significance in the player's experience, not only because of their narrative relevance, but also for the particularities that tie them into the feeling of wonder, like spotting the dragon for the first time, creates a sense of artificiality, as if it was intended for the focus to be redirected to what's actually meaningful.
Not enough. I must stay in the eye of the whirlwind. Must push myself harder.
The DLC ends with two of the best joke-like moments in the game. The boss fight breaks with the uncreative development of gameplay and embraces a ninja battle with frenetic electronic music. And the final prize for your efforts, described as the ultimate weapon created by the Shakers, is a motorcycle. But that's not the end. The DLC closes with the last homage to the champions, and a memory that's both beautiful for what it is and absurd for coming right after Link was rewarded a bike. But that's the nature of the Champions Ballad. Aside from the shrines and the dungeons, it builds non-interesting gameplay as a means to later show how raw objectiveness isn't serious enough to receive the same attention as the intricacy of the characters. It definitely has a different tone from the rest of the game, but both of them reach the same narrative conclusion. Breath of the Wild doesn't focus on the importance of reaching the end, but on learning about what's always around. Maybe more than other Zeldas, it's not that much about acknowledging how a task affects the player, but it doesn't have less of the learning process present in those other games. The weight of destiny affects greatly another character, whom Link learns with and takes her sufferings into account. In the end, all of the curiosity built around another one, be it a character or any mysterious structure in the world, makes the experience a constant and beautiful absorption of the external. So even if objectiveness doesn't weigh on the player that much, given how there's constant discovery and learning, the weight of objectiveness in Zelda hits as strong as the weight that affects Link in any other game. The most beautiful lesson Breath of the Wild gave to the open world genre is to never lose sense of how the wonders of the world are much more meaningful than a high number, a world ranking, a complete skill tree, and so on. So, that's it for the video. I hope I could provide some fresh thoughts on the series. If you're still here, thank you so very much for watching. Hidden Frame is an ongoing project where I discuss video games in depth, so all the support is very much appreciated. If there's anything you want to address, criticize or compliment, feel free to leave a comment so we can chat. This was Hidden Frame, and I'll see you next time.